everybody, and welcome to another video tutorial. Now for this week's tutorial I am showing you essentially a compilation of the crypt design that I did about last week. So this is essentially the line work process that I use. Now in the initial stages of this line work I was actually using a different technique to do the columns. I was just using only the pen tool to do it. I since started using the shapes tools as well. And since I started doing that, I have a much better structure for the columns. So you will see later on that the structure for the columns changes quite a bit, and that's because I've modified the structure to fit more accurately with the perspective. So right now I'm working actually, it's not exactly the foreground element, but it's fairly close at the moment. And I'm figuring out the design for the coffin that's on top of the table. Now in the initial sketch I had some skulls on the table instead, but since it's called a crypt I decided to add some more sarcophagus or coffins inside the layout to help reinforce the theme of this image. So as you can see I'm roughing out quite a bit of the information. I'm working on the second set of columns right now. Once again, I'm using the pen tool. I will later on actually start using the shape tool instead to make more accurate ellipses, and you will see a big difference in the structure because it will actually fit quite a bit more structurally with what it's supposed to look like. So as you can see I'm working on the arches, the top portion. These are based off actual crypts that were, I believe, done either during the Renaissance, but most likely during the Gothic period, I'm assuming, based on the reference material that I had. So they had very unusual tops, where essentially the tops were segmented into several portions and they interlinked with surrounding ones. Now since these are on the walls and actually attached to walls, I essentially created the initial design, duplicated that, and then actually cut off a portion of that design to help insert it into the wall. So it's essentially one piece. It's something that I was working on because it shows a bit more of the structure and how, if somebody was actually building this, how they would go about it, it would actually fit into each other. So right now you can see that I'm actually starting to use the ellipse tool to do those columns, and you can see already that there's a huge difference in the quality of the image afterwards. So what I generally do is I do the one, then I duplicate that, move it to the side and use it as a template, and then rework out the design, make sure all the perspective is correct obviously as I'm working, and just fine tune the line work so that as I'm moving further back I'm actually reducing the size of the columns and the line size as well. So I started actually using a fairly small brush for this. So I'm using the standard hard brush throughout this image. I have not used any texture brushes at all. The main reason why is because if you want to have really good artwork or line work that's very solid, you want a very nice crisp line. I'm not going for a stylized look, so it doesn't make sense to use a stylized brush. Now this same technique can easily be used with a stylized brush quite easily, and it will give you a different effect. Now, since I am going for a very clean look though overall, I'm not using a textured brush. Maybe later on in later videos I may actually start using some of my textured brushes in a similar manner, but for now I'm trying to have very clean line work to work with. This clean line work actually makes it easier for the painting process, where I can actually use the magic wand tool and actually select portions. Although it's rare for me to actually do that, I tend to paint in more of the attributes and the colors that I want in an image. It's something to keep in mind because it can be actually very useful depending on what you're trying to achieve. Now this entire portion, just the line work itself, the cleanup stage, once I added in all the hours I spent, it actually took close to 13 hours to do. And that's mainly because it was so intricate, and I was also experimenting with a lot of techniques. You'll see later on how I experiment with some of the motifs and the detail work once I have the basic structure in. And I start moving between Illustrator and all that. So Ideally, I probably would have saved an extra 2 hours if I hadn't been experimenting with techniques. 2 to 3 hours, I'd say. About 8 to 9 hours was actually done offline, so that I could have a reasonable deadline for this image, so I wasn't doing the line work continuously throughout my streams. So I only show generally about 2-3 hours of the work that I actually do now for my line work. Mainly keep it more it's a bit more entertaining that way, because it's too repetitive otherwise. It gives you a general idea of techniques that I'm using in those first 2-3 hours, and essentially it's just repeating the same techniques, but playing with the structure and all that until I end up with something that works. So right now I'm actually erasing a portion that I accidentally flattened the image at the wrong time with the wrong layer selected, so I had that and it was actually interfering with the line work I already had, so I had to go in manually and erase everything related to that. It's something I do try to avoid, however, can't always catch it, so I had to go in and I had to modify that. So right now I'm actually using, once again, the default hard brush, but I'm going in and erasing certain portions to add the detail work for that stone pathway. You'll see me doing that also in the brick area as well later on. So right now I'm working on the staircase. This is a very complicated staircase because of the curves in it, and I do end up cheating the perspective a bit on the top of the stairs. You will see later on. And it actually works a lot better structurally. It looks much more appealing. Although I do try to follow the general rules of perspective, there are certain times that following the rules just doesn't work for an image, and you have to actually cheat it in order to make it look more believable. Because in the end, these images are interpretations of the world around you, so you have to have a good balance between the two when you're working. Once again, I'm working on the stairs. You'll see me modifying the top and playing with the top structure quite a bit until I end up with something that works quite well. So these are fairly large stairs, as you can see, given the size ratio. And at this point, I actually just make the lines parallel because it works better visually in the end. So the stairs were actually, took about 2 to 3 hours actually just to complete the stairs. I did about 1 hour on the live stream and then had to modify quite a bit of it offline as well. So I'm just working on the post there, repeating the same design that I had on the initial one, and adding some structural elements to give it some credibility, because those posts would need some form of support in order to work properly. So now that I have the basic structure, I'm actually modifying the perspective a bit on this. At this point I've realized, oh well, the structure's not that appealing, so I modified it slightly. And I'm just adding some basic structural elements, once again, to show what's behind or further away from the columns, because it's essentially leading into a separate hallway. Now, because of this perspective that I've added into the staircase, however, that second column closest to the viewer on the left is too close, so I have to actually modify the perspective. And you'll actually see me do that very shortly. Once again, tying in the exact same elements into that further element there. I want to keep everything consistent, so it's finding a good compromise between those two to make it more believable. Okay, so I'm just adding some detail work now. And once again, as I'm moving further, I'm lowering the size of my brush. So I am fixing the structure now for that column. You'll see me actually do quite a few changes in that as I'm working. I've already established essentially the basic structure that this column would have, so now it's more of a matter of refining the detail elements to make sure, one, that they work structurally and they work in the same perspective as well, because the perspective elements for this column just weren't accurate, so I just went in and modified that. I did originally cheat the perspective on this column initially, knowingly, but once I had the staircase in, I had to go in and I had to actually make sure that it was actually properly done. Because unfortunately it did show, so if it shows, then you kind of have to modify and change it. So now I'm working on detail elements. So I was experimenting quite a bit with the detail elements. So I tried opening up Illustrator for this portion, figured out a pretty cool detail element, but decided that unless I was able to bring this in, vectorize into Photoshop, that this level of detail unfortunately would just not work for my purposes. So I went back and forth for a bit, tried to figure it out. Like I said, I like the detail element that I came up with. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work workflow-wise with what I was trying to achieve. So I just went in there and I ended up drawing actually most of it, and it turned out to be easier. So right now I'm creating a custom brush so that I can create the basic pattern work. And I save that brush and change some of the settings so that I can actually create some basic detail work in there. Now the big, most important part is when it's actually being painted is I have to make sure certain areas are highlighted. As long as those are done correctly, this will actually be believable as a pattern, as a three-dimensional pattern at that. I'm just working on the face right now. And this is an element I'm going to duplicate and copy next to it and change the perspective to make it accurate. And then I just copied that element and I pasted it below, and I was just playing around with some of the structures, see what I was going to actually end up with. I ended up actually just drawing it all in. It was just easier. And I did the same thing actually for these elements here, is I just drew them in. They were just simple to do that way. And then I just copied it to a certain degree. Once the perspective is too far away, then you have to actually draw it in individually. Essentially for this portion, I'm just selecting the areas that I'm going to paint in with the wand tool and the pen tool, and I'm just going in and adding some, once again, that detail work. Now as I'm receding, once again, I'm going to add less and less information to help solidify the fact that it's actually receding in the background. The detail work didn't take very long. I did it at the same time as the other one. It probably took around 1 to 2 hours. It wasn't that long. The basic structure is generally what takes the longest, because if you make a mistake in the basic structure, it shows. So you have to spend that extra time to make sure that the information is accurate as much as possible, that is. Just adding some last minute details onto that column there that's closest to the viewer. And adding some of that brick motif. Once again, I'm using the same technique as the bricks on the ground there. And I'm just adding a banner logo for this coffin. I'm just using the pen tool once again, and a combination between the pen tool and the brush tool and the warp tools, just to get something that works well. So this image is nearly completed. The painting portion for this actually took just a couple of hours. It was really short. So this is the final image. As you can see, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.